Hello and welcome to Critical Eye. Tonight's programme will focus on cyber wars, and in particular focusing on the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the 41st anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. What does that mean, and what is the impact of the Islamic Revolution around the world in a digital age which actually can make or break ideas, narratives, and you can actually hijack all sorts of terminology and turn it into what you want? Is the Islamic Revolution something which is clear to the world? Has the message of the original ethos of Ayatollah Khomeini maintained itself? And how is it coping within the world of cyber warfare? How is the Iranian reaction to, if you like, US-Israeli cyber warfare going, and what are the Iranians actually doing about countering that or launching their own particular wars? These and many other questions are going to be dealt with during the course of the show. With me, I've got the pleasure today of having Roshan Mohammed Saleh on the show. Welcome, Roshan. Journalist, analyst, and currently focusing largely on Five Pillars, an Islamic magazine which actually looks at things with an alternative lens and hopefully gives people a fresh set of perspectives that challenge a lot of the mainstream media fake news, dare I say it. But alongside him is Maulana Syed Mohammed Razavi. Welcome, Aga.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you. And a keen analyst of the Islamic Revolution, somebody who actually lived in Iran at the time when the revolution was taking place as well. And of course, no stranger to this subject will be my good friend Mohammed Carter. Welcome. Mohammed, how are you?
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks so much for having me on.
Good to have you on board. Journalist for Press TV, presenter extraordinaire, and actually gets out in the field reporting on many of these kinds of issues. And arguably Press TV, for which Roshan is also still actually a prominent journalist and presenter, has been at the arguably at the end of a lot of the kind of the damage which modern day censorship has, which we may deal with perhaps in the second part of our programme in terms of civil liberties and censorship in the modern age. That's going to be part two of Critical Eye today. This short report, actually by Roshan for Press TV, gives us an interesting insight into cyber warfare, though, and perhaps that's what we'll kickstart the show with.
Britain is known around the world as a nation that isn't afraid to deploy its military to launch wars and occupations. But in the modern world of sophisticated technology, the UK is set to concentrate on another type of warfare. Around 2 years ago, the British government launched a £650 million national cyber security programme. The purpose was to defend the UK from cyber attacks, from hackers, criminals, and even from foreign governments. But now MPs are saying that being defensive is no longer an option. They want the government to go on the offensive and to launch cyber warfare in the interest of national security. Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee recommends covert operations to disrupt the computer networks of those targeting the UK. One tactic is known as active defence, interfering with the systems of those trying to hack into UK networks and obtaining intelligence without being detected. The report also suggests aggressively disrupting the systems of others to hamper their activities, again without being detected.
Well, Britain isn't the victim. Britain is home to GCHQ, the biggest spy base in the world outside of America. And of course, GCHQ works exclusively with the Americans, monitoring phone calls, emails, people's computers. It's a huge spy base built after the Second World War on the basis of, and very much part of that so-called special relationship between Britain and America.
Chris Bambury also believes that the leading Western nations are unwilling to call a truce in the cyber war being waged.
Russia and China are prepared to come to some agreement on regulating what's happening here with the use of cyber wars. It's the Americans and, of course, as always, the Israelis who don't want to do that, and indeed the British, because they are ahead in the game. They don't actually want any regulation. They want to continue what they're doing.
Britain is currently thought to be part of a second tier of nations that possess sophisticated cyber defences, but haven't yet decided to make offensive capability a major priority, unlike the United States and Israel. But that now appears to be changing, and we could be entering into a new era where the World Wide Web becomes militarised, with potentially disturbing and unpredictable consequences.
report there, Roshan. It's probably so long ago. That's about 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Still not dated in many ways. The issues that you raised in that are probably even more vital and important today. What's your take on this whole business of?
I'm just getting over the. I look like a schoolboy, don't I? Back then. Well, obviously there's an information war going on. There has been, there's a hard war going on, but there's also a soft war. And in many ways, I think the soft war may be more important because ultimately war is very expensive, isn't it? And invading and occupying countries is very expensive. But if you can persuade people to adhere to your point of view without firing a bullet or occupying a country, then that is much better. And I think ultimately that's how America hope that they can defeat, let's say, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Not by invading Iran and occupying Iran, which is too difficult, but by pumping in propaganda and basically trying to make the Iranian people rise against their own government. And I think there is a cyber army in Iran now, which is trying to counter that, but obviously the Western media has had 100 years or more to establish itself, and it's got the backing of the world's most powerful military, world's most powerful economies. So in a way, their propaganda is far greater and more effective than Iranian propaganda.
Well, that's a good opening salvo. Maulana, you were in Iran during the revolution's birth, if you like, and at that time, the Islamic Republic had none of these techniques of cyber warfare. They had no real scientific base. Arguably, they were basically a puppet government of the Americans, which basically was being remote controlled from abroad, much like the Saudi Arabian, if you like, nation and its kind of, if you like, state apparatus is today. But Iran has moved on now. There is obviously a lot of advancement that's clearly there in terms of cyber abilities, internet, digital controls. They're launching satellites. They're going into space. They've got ballistic missiles now. All of this is very upsetting for the Americans and the Israelis, and has almost brought us to the brink of a really major war in that region not more than a few weeks ago. Is it something which the Islamic Republic now is absolutely going to go broke on in terms of investing in more of their cyber skills? Because I'll raise the issue of the aeroplane that got, the Boeing plane that got shot down by, it seems, Iranian, if you like, defense systems. There was some talk about that being a cyber attack by the American. It's still not clear as to why that mistake was made at that time and who was really involved. Is this part of some of the vulnerability that might still be there and the superiority that Roshan talks about in terms of American and Israeli cyber techniques?
Yeah, it reminds me how before Islamic Revolution in Iran, I had some friends who it was right in the middle of peak of revolution, and they wanted to take the message of Ayatollah Khomeini to other parts of Iran. And the way they used to they take this message was wrapping cassettes in plastic bags and placing them in watermelons and printing lots of leaflets and of messages and putting in watermelons and hiding them and then taking them to other places, because there was no fax, no email, no social media. This is how they passed the messages and brought the revolution. And nowadays it's much easier. I mean, America and the West just sits and just directs their agents in Iran, and they go and start making trouble in the streets. I mean, I've seen clips that how openly they were instructing the troublemakers to create fire and problem in the streets to show as if big trouble is going on. At the same time, those few people who were demonstrating in Iran, Paris was witnessing much greater riots, but the media was not reporting the riots of Paris the way they were reporting the riots in Tehran.
What do you think about this, Mohammed? This idea of using in the broader sense, cyber warfare, one thing is, of course, using it as a means of military attack and disconnecting each other, but it has much wider connotations, and some of those can be in terms of color revolutions and engineering social media to do certain things and to present certain narratives. How powerful is that as a weapon for, certainly from a Western perspective, to try and create regime changes, etc.?
I think it's a very powerful weapon, and I think that the US and other Western imperialist powers know it very well. And we've seen a lot of evidence to suggest that they are definitely using that weapon as a stick to try and beat the Islamic Revolution away with and to try and oust them from power. There's a lot of issue over social media apps now and other social media platforms like Instagram. You have communication apps like WhatsApp and Telegram and things like that. And inside Iran, they can be quite controversial. A lot of them are actually banned as well. And you get, Western organizations claiming, well, this is a breach of human rights, for example. But what they don't contextualize is that there is the Islamic Republic and its government and its military, they know, and even its people as well, they know that these apps, these social media platforms are being used by Western powers and their, like say, for example, the CIA or MI5, something along those lines, these intelligence services, to peddle fake news, to peddle Western propaganda, which attacks the Islamic Republic. And this spread of fake news, Donald Trump and these US Western neocons, they always talk about how fake news this, attacking them. But what they don't mention is that they actually use the same weapon of fake news against the Islamic Republic of Iran and other countries which they don't like, and all these anti-imperialist nations like Venezuela and other Latin American nations, elsewhere in Asia and the African continent, they're all complaining about the same thing, and that is that social media is censoring their perspective on the news or geopolitics and things like that, which isn't fair. And they're also complaining about the fact that, the organisation of mass protests, for example, is being peddled. And obviously these protests have a tendency to turn violent and to encourage violence against the establishment there. But in reverse, it's not tolerated here in the West. Like in France, you have a peaceful, unarmed protest movement, the Yellow Vest movement, and they, of course, use social media to try and rally themselves and to organise themselves. But you actually have Facebook now closing down their accounts and things like that, and you also have censorship of them and the lack of mainstream media coverage of the state-sponsored suppression, brutal suppression of that protest. That isn't discussed at all. But if one small group of disgruntled Iranians or Iraqis or whoever else comes out into the streets, 10, 20 or 50 of them, it's given round-the-clock coverage on mainstream media, and then social media is used as a backup to that. It's shared by the likes of Mike Pompeo, the US Foreign Secretary, who shared a small video clip he conjured out. He plucked from somewhere on Twitter of 50 Iraqis, who were allegedly celebrating the death of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani last month. And he said that this was proof that Iraqis hated Iran and that they were celebrating the death. But what he didn't share, and what a lot of other mainstream media platforms and Western neocons didn't share, was the millions of Muslims who were coming out into the streets to mourn the loss of what they deemed were martyrs and their solidarity and support for the Islamic Revolution. So we have to be really careful. I think Iran has to be very careful about this issue of social media, its effects on that country, and also just fake news in general and the digital colonialism. That's what it's being referred to now by some.
That's interesting.
And this is a massive, massive danger in the modern world.
Well, I'm sure Roshan's going to come in on several points that you guys have raised, but my two bobs worth is that there was something called the Tolpiot program, which the Israelis kicked off with in post-1973 after, I think, the Yom Kippur, and when they realised they had to be ahead of the game. And it seems the Tolpiot program now, through the Unit 8200, which is the equivalent of the British GCHQ, only much, much more powerful, powerful, seems to be generating an army of young whiz kids, scientific whiz kids. And in fact, Israel is becoming the hub of most of the cyber, if you like, expertise. And in fact, it's even claimed that the internet largely runs, the global internet, all runs through this kind of Topia program network of individuals, so that whether it's nuclear weapons controlled by the Russians, or nuclear or weapons controlled in America, or whether it's the intelligence services and their, if you like, programs, their cyber programs, their internet programs, it's said that actually all of this gets accumulated in Tel Aviv. Actually, with Unit 8200, they have access to all of these units. That's really frightening, Roshan, to think that it might be a hub somewhere that actually has access to all of the nuclear weapons, if you like, button pressing or codes, and it might have access to your and my information. This is quite frightening, actually. We're living in quite an Orwellian dystopian scenario.
Well, as you alluded to earlier, there was some speculation that the Ukrainian plane that was brought down by the Iranians actually wasn't brought down by the Iranians, it was brought down by the Israelis who managed to hack into the system. Now, that might be speculation, it might not be true. The Iranians certainly aren't confirming that. They don't think they would confirm that. But it is quite frightening, and I think, obviously, the Iranians are faced with a dilemma because on the one hand, it's not a good look to shut down Facebook or to shut down different social media platforms, and obviously the West will use that as a stick to beat Iran with, where's the freedom of the speech, etc., etc. But on the other hand, these platforms are being used to mobilize dissent, and this dissent is being funded from abroad. And obviously, I remember when Mazia Bahari, the Newsweek journalist who alleges he was tortured in Iran and was interviewed by Press TV, and that culminated in Ofcom taking Mazia Bahari's side, believing his version of events, not believing Press TV's version of events, and Press TV got kicked off Sky. One thing that he said is that basically Iranian media should be banned in Britain as a reciprocal measure because the BBC was banned in Iran. But it's not comparing like with like, because ultimately the BBC is this all-pervasive organisation backed by billions of dollars, with huge penetration all around the world. It can literally lead to riots in countries. They can instigate regime change. Whereas Press TV, I don't want to make Press TV look small, but it's 10 years old. It's not out to instigate regime change anywhere. Yes, it's critical of some aspects of British society, but from a legitimate perspective, a peaceful perspective, it's not trying to instigate revolution or anything like that. So it's not comparing like with like. But the coverage of Iran is absolutely horrendous. From the mainstream media, from the left, The Guardian, to the right, The Times, they all seem to share this blatant attempt to kind of instigate chaos in the country, violence on the streets, with their end goal of colour revolution, as you said, and regime change.
Maulana, obviously agreement from both my other guests about the kind of vilification and the targeting of the Islamic Republic. Grand Ayatollah Khamenei has made it very clear that the apparatus within Iran has to be vigilant, and they know they're under constant attack. They've survived so far 41 years. Do you think it'll survive another 40 years, the Islamic Republic, given the sophisticated attacks and the amount of funding and finance that's going into trying to bring it down through this, in particular, the cyber warfare? And I'll extend cyber warfare, because if I count the idea of culture, the use of culture as an attack on a nation, so if you were going to undermine a nation's cultural, if you like, ideology. I mean, and there is an ideology in Iran. The ideology is based around Islam, it's based around certain moral values, it's based around certain restrictions as well about behavior, moral behavior. Of course, when you've got Hollywood and you've got a massive industry which is capable of churning out the highest quality cultural, if you like, messages and programming, that's accessible across the internet. So technically, that's also part of a cyber warfare. Is that impacting the Islamic Republic of Iran? How much is that impacting them? Because you can have the military warfare, you can have the news warfare, which we talked about, the information warfare. But what about the more subtle cultural warfare that could be sent in to Iran through this cyber, methodology?
There's no doubt that cyber war is taking place, and Ayatollah Khamenei has also referred in his speech several times that we need unknown soldiers to deal and tackle with this. And alhamdulillah, there are hundreds and I could say thousands of trained people who are getting into this field, and they are fighting and struggling and defending Islamic values in Iran. But beside this, I would like to also add and say that a quote verse of Holy Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Quran says, "Makaru wa makar Allahu, Allahu khairul makirin." Enemies plan and Allah plans. And Allah's plannings are always successful. So, and recent events has showed that, for example, before Qasim Soleimani's assassination, they were kind of happy and successful. Protests were going on in Iraq and in Iran, engineered by the West. And suddenly, assassination of Qasim Soleimani united the whole Iraqis and Iranians all together against them. And even Iranians who were not in support of Islamic Republic of Iran, because they felt that a national hero was targeted, they got united against America. I heard many of the Shah's supporters were angry, and they came even to Islamic Center of England to take part in the funeral majlis that was held in Islamic Center, which made history in Islamic Center of England itself. More than Ashura, people who took part in that gathering were more than the day of Ashura. Ashura is the usually biggest gathering of Islamic Center, but this gathering was much bigger than any other gathering. What I'm trying to say that enemy plan and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans, and Allah's plannings are always successful.
Without a doubt. I mean, I think from the ideology that certainly the Islamic Republic has of divine spiritual intervention and to rely on that.
We believe in promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made promises in Holy Quran that people who are defending mustad'afin and oppressed people of the world will be victorious at the end.
This is really critical because the original remit from Ayatollah Khomeini certainly was one, to create a religious democracy, which arguably exists, by hook or crook. Walayat Faqih is still in operation. It's still the only system which formally tries to combine a democratic notion. In actual fact, I would argue that Socrates was who's linked to Greeks, and democracy in the West is all alluded to within that Athenian system. Funny enough, Socrates didn't really like democracy, and in fact was the victim of a democratic vote that actually ended up having him killed. He died at the hands of people who actually voted for him to be put to death. Now, that's interesting because he says that democracy in the hands of the ordinary folk, if they're not qualified, if they don't know politics and they don't have wisdom, is actually dangerous. It's a dangerous weapon. Now, the Islamic Republic could argue that we've got a system here of governance which says, yes, have democracy, and yes, let's educate the public first of all so that they understand the issues. But actually, ultimately, we also need to have, arguably, we need to have this mechanism which can also regulate. Walayat Faqih and Ayatollah Khamenei, the Guardianship Council, set of men, jurisprudence, people who are supposed to also have wisdom of a spiritual kind, is a concept which obviously totally goes against the gut instinct of democracy as we know it in the West. But do you think that's possibly a superior system? Because actually there is a set of wisdom-based individuals that can actually look at immoral politics, immoral politicians, corrupt systems, and change them? Because there's been a big issue about corruption in Iran as well. Do you think that that's where there is a strength that could be utilized as well by Iran?
Yes, I mean, although as you rightly mentioned that corruption is everywhere, and the world who is targeting Iran is a corrupt world. I mean, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib used to say that if I wanted to be a dirty politician like them, I would be victorious. But he didn't use the dirty politics. The Islamic Republic of Iran does not use dirty politics. Even in the retaliation or when they attacked the military base in Iraq, the aim was not to kill. The aim was only to teach the enemies the lesson that we are able to target you. So if you go further, we are willing to go further. So Islamic Republic of Iran is taking care of the moral and ethical values, but others are not.
Okay, I'm going to come on to that attack again with you, Mohammed. This issue of they actually must have jammed the American systems. Evidently, that's what happened. Again, cyber warfare was in place. The American jets, the helicopters, the warning systems, although they did warn them, they didn't seem to have any defense. There was talk of those jets and those planes having their systems, their sort of electronical, internet-linked systems shut down as well. That's pretty heavy. That's a major advance for a nation like Iran to be able to claim that it can do that on a military level, and a big warning for the Americans in any forthcoming battle that they might be thinking of.
Yes, I think that the Islamic Republic of Iran is obviously misunderstood, they're underestimated, I think, especially under the current US admin, Donald Trump, who, he doesn't know two things about the Middle East. He doesn't understand Arab or Iranian or Muslim culture at all. And in fact, many of the mistakes he makes, I think, is based on his lack of knowledge of the region. And I think that's why, the game he was playing with Iran early this year in January, where he thought that it was totally acceptable to assassinate one of their most highest ranking, most popular military figures when he was visiting an allied country, attempting to promote peace in the region. This is what the Iranians admitted afterwards, that Soleimani was in Iraq to respond to the Saudi Arabians to attempt to try and bring them to the negotiating table, essentially that type of thing. So this is obviously a rogue action. It's something that a barbaric rogue state would do. But that's what the US accuses Iran of being all the time. And I think the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammed Zarif said very, very clearly that their response to the situation would be proportionate, although the US was being disproportionate in its actions. So they've got a moral high ground here. And obviously, coming back to what you're saying about the technological issue, Iran has new challenges. And the digital age that we're living in now is obviously one of the new spheres of challenge that they have to deal with. And I hope that they'll deal with it effectively. But what I can say is that now that we're commemorating 41-year anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, they've had many, many challenges over the 4 decades that they've been continuously harassed and targeted by these Western imperial powers that wanted the Islamic Revolution defeated ever since they ousted the Shah back in 1979. Since that day, the US, the UK, Europe, to a certain extent, have all tried their utmost to ensure that the Islamic Revolution fails. And always, always, the Iranians, due to their own initiative, hard work, determination, they've always pulled through. And we're talking about a country which has been sanctioned. There are more sanctions on Iran than I think Russia, China, and North Korea combined. On this one country, they have more sanctions than all these other countries are dealing with. You also had I think it was a 7-year Iran-Iraq war, where, again, almost the entire world was ganging up on Iran. The UN even wasn't supporting Iran when chemical weapons were being used to mass murder innocent civilians in that country. So, for all these neocons in the West who think that the Islamic Revolution is on its last legs, you had John Bolton, another famous Western neocon, who said that the Islamic Republic of Iran wouldn't pass its 40th birthday. Well, this is 41st. They've passed it now. They're looking stronger than they have been for a very long time. They're improving in the realms of science and things like that, domestic produce. Their resistance economy is working. It's a working system. And yes, they're struggling and facing problems. Even the Iranians admitted themselves that they have hardships. But that doesn't mean that they're on the verge of collapse. The Iranian people are as determined as ever, and the funeral procession for the senior Iranian General Qasem Soleimani is proof that the Iranian people stand behind their revolution, and all this fake news that we see pumped out of the West via social media is being proven wrong. But you have to look past the headlines. You have to listen to what the Iranians are saying and learn about the country.
Well, today again, millions turned out to support the Islamic revolutions, if you like.
On the 40th of Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah. So, Roshan, in conclusion, for this part of the program, we'll come back with the issue of censorship, etc., and civil liberties in the West, which is an extension of the discussion in a way as well. But your conclusion, one of the aims of the Islamic Revolution was to wake Muslims up to regain their liberty, to regain their, if you like, sovereignties, and to throw out the Americans. In Iraq, we're hearing today that, the Americans in Bloomberg, there was a report from Bloomberg saying that 15 of their bases may well be vacated or begun to be vacated. In Yemen, we're seeing a pushback. In Palestine, we're seeing an open, revolt against the Israelis. We're not seeing it, of course, in Morocco or places like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. There are still lots of Muslim nations which don't want anything to do with the Islamic Revolution and far from it. How do you see the next 10 years perhaps panning out in terms of the revolutionary ideas of pushing out hegemonic powers from the Middle East? Do you see it going in the direction of liberty and freedom of the Arab peoples particularly?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, I'm not Iranian, I'm not a Shia Muslim, I'm Sunni, but I was inspired by the Islamic Revolution as a teenager, and the values of Islam. The Islamic world's been on its knees for a long time, and it was a revival of Islamic values, Palestine, anti-imperialism, the very fact that a Muslim country in the Middle East could be independent and take its, kind of domestic and foreign policy decisions in its own capital rather than having to consult Washington or London. So it's a challenge to maintain those values without a doubt. It's been under constant pressure. I think anyone who's visited Iran or lived in Iran will know that it's a modern nation, a successful nation. When you compare it to most of the countries around it, it's done very well despite all the pressures. It has a strong military, educated population, and ultimately the vast majority of that population support the Islamic Revolution, even if there are divisions within people who do support the revolution. And those who are against and are probably working with foreign governments to try and overturn the Islamic Republic are very much in the small minority. As your question, I've actually forgotten your question because I went off on such a tangent.
It was 10 years. Do you think the rest of the Muslim world will rise up?
I think ultimately the Islamic Revolution has had a profound effect around the world. However, there has been a pushback against it, and we see in the Middle East, we see Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain allying with Israel in an attempt to push back against the Islamic Revolution. But I think ultimately, despite all the challenges, ultimately the reason why Saudi Arabia and Israel are perhaps panicking and want Iran to be attacked right now is because they know the clock is ticking. They know the energy age will be over soon and the whole region will be less strategic. And therefore Saudi Arabia will be less important for the Americans, as will Israel. So they want to. They see this window of opportunity now to take down the Islamic Republic. They want the Americans to do it for them, But ultimately, the values that will endure are the Islamic values, the values of independence and anti-imperialism, which will outlast Israel, which will outlast Saudi Arabia. So I think it will be a struggle to consolidate those values. I do worry sometimes about the Iranian people themselves. Obviously the first generation fought that war against Iraq, imposed war backed by the West against Iran, which cost 1 million people on both sides. So they understand the values of the Islamic Revolution. But the younger ones, do they really understand the values? Are they more concerned about living standards than those values that I talk about? That does concern me, and that is the challenge for Iran's leaders to instill those values in their own people.
Thank you, gentlemen. A very valuable set of points raised. Certainly, this issue of cyber warfare is rooted in the notion of science and being advanced scientifically. Iran was the fastest growing scientific nation in 2011, and it's maintained that trajectory. Ayatollah Khamenei has made it clear that there's going to be a massive focus on the military, science, and technology. That's an ongoing thing, rooted in hopefully a moral and a spiritual, if you like, commitment, which has always been there. Certainly, I believe it's there within the centrality of the Islamic Revolution. It still exists as it did under Ayatollah Khomeini, which is very encouraging, I think, for those who want a moral world to emerge in the latter part of the 21st century. And arguably, that's a responsibility that the Islamic Revolution has taken up, and they're going to get attacked from it in every way, shape, and form. That's just part of the reality. What our responsibilities are, how we fit in, these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. I would say that those responsibilities, whether it's fighting for the NHS here in Britain, whether it's fighting for the liberty for the homeless, whether it's also fighting against the lies of austerity that perhaps the Tories roll out, I believe these are all extensions of the Islamic revolutionary push for justice, a genuine, real justice around the world. They are all included within that manifesto, in my opinion. It may not be in the exact, if you like, language of what's traditionally regarded as Islam by people around the world. But believe me, in my opinion, anything which fights for true justice ultimately comes under the banner, for me, of Islamic revolution. It's really looking for a humanitarian world which is based on truth, and peace can't be achieved without real justice. That's, I think, perhaps the biggest role that certainly Ayatollah Khamenei and his core movement can contribute to the world, and that will mean, I think, ultimately taking most of the flak as well for the next 10 years or so from all those who stand to lose from that kind of stance. Thank you for watching this part of Critical Eye. Join us again for the second part of our show.